and I will turn to Senator Roberts.
Thank you, Chair. My questions, and thank you for attending today. My questions initially go to the Reserve Bank, and then, if there's time, to ACCC. To the Reserve Bank, cash is legal tender. Isn't it part of a bank's social licence, a duty of a bank to provide access to legal tender?
Well, the banks obviously do provide cash services. The services they provide to their customers are in their own business models. The Reserve Bank doesn't have any mandate to legislate or to regulate access to cash services. That's really a matter for the banks and for providing those services to their customers. So banks will usually provide the services their customers look to access, and as long as customers want to access cash services, banks should provide it. So
I would have imagined that, and I'm not experienced in your area, but I would have imagined that as part of being a bank, it would have been a requirement to be able to provide legal tender cash. Not correct?
Well, there's no obligation to provide legal tender services that I'm aware of from the banks, but I'm not an expert in that space. But certainly the position that we see is that the Australian public, many members of the Australian public, still want to use cash as a means of payment, and they access that cash from their banks. So the consumers still want to use cash, although a much smaller proportion of consumers wish to use cash, but there are still consumers who do use it and do need to use it. And so if that is a product that the banks need to provide to their consumers because the consumers demand access to it.
Okay, I would have thought it was a responsibility, almost a condition of having a banking licence. But let's continue. In your submission you state, quote, the cash share of payments by consumers in regional areas fell from 35% in 2019 to 14% in 2022. What is your measure used for cash share, please, since the Reserve Bank isn't notified when someone buys a cup of coffee at a cafe with cash, for instance? How did you arrive at these figures?
I might hand that to my colleague.
I believe the numbers that you're talking about are most likely come from our consumer payment survey, which is something that the Reserve Bank does every 3 years, where it asks people to essentially fill in a diary of every payment that they make over the course of a week. So we have quite detailed information spread across different demographics and different locations of how people are making their payments. I don't have those precise figures in front of me, but when we're talking about the cash share of payments, then most often we're referring to the results of that consumer payment survey.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher. Could we get those figures on notice, please?
Yeah, of course. The numbers that I do have in front of me are that the cash share of payments in 2022 was a little under 10% for people living in regional and remote areas, and actually what the 2022 survey showed that wasn't all that different from people living in the major cities. But that's not to say that some people don't use cash much more intensively, including in those regional and remote areas.
And it doesn't show the severity of not being able to access cash. For some people it is crucial because they do everything in cash.
Yes, that's right. And one thing that we do from the consumer payment survey is you can classify people into how intensively they use cash, and what that shows is that something like 1 in 20 people during that survey week use cash for all their in-person payments, and it does show that certain demographic groups tend to use cash a lot more intensively than others, even though those shares have been declining over time.
Okay, thank you. The evidence is clear from previous hearings of this committee that banks are trying to drive down the use of cash, destroy the use of cash. That's quite clear. Cash could be circulating more than you state without your knowledge. Does this figure provide air cover for the bank's war on cash without having solid basis, in fact, apart from a survey?
I can't comment on the issue of whether it's providing cover for the banks, but what I can say is that the survey is designed to be very comprehensive It's the best measure of cash use that we have. It surveys a significant number of people, and a lot of effort by the survey firm goes into making sure that it's representative of the Australian population, so we do have a reasonably good picture, a good snapshot at a particular point in time of how people are using cash across the economy.
Now, I understand, just as a side point, that the Reserve Bank of Australia has done work on establishing a digital currency. That's correct, right?
Sorry, sure.
Well, we are, like many central banks around the world, we are doing some experiments and some analysis of a digital currency, but we have not, we're still working through that, and there are no direct plans to establish a digital currency.
Okay, thank you. Let's get back to the cash figures. A merchant who can't deposit cash in their bank because the bank has been closed and who can't deposit in an ATM because their ATM has been ripped out is not going to accept cash they can't bank, can't use to pay to suppliers, insurance, advertising and rent. Isn't it true regional merchants are no longer accepting cash because they can't use that cash in their businesses?
I think what I might speak to there, Senator, is the analysis that we do, which I believe some of might have been in our previous submission, which is that our overall assessment is that access to cash in terms of the distance that people have to travel for withdrawal and deposit services hasn't changed a great deal in recent years. The nature of those services may have changed though. If a bank branch is closed, people may have to either travel a little bit further to access full branch style services or switch to an alternative source of cash access. And I think it is reasonable to say that the elements of what you can call the cash cycle are interrelated. Cash use, cash access, and cash acceptance are all, I guess, pieces of the total cash use puzzle.
Thank you. That's a very important point you've made, because if the banks want to drive people off cash so they can get access, so they can get fees and greater income from handling digital transactions, then they can use what you just said.
I can't really speak to the motivations of the bank, but I think it's reasonable to suggest that there's different elements of the cash use cycle that are related, and we've published some analysis on the different elements of the cash use cycle in one of our bulletin articles, which I'd be happy to provide to the committee if that's of interest.
Thank you. Let's get back to the alternative sources of cash other than bank in some towns. Isn't it true that post offices have a role to play in providing cash, but they are not banks? They do not have after-hours ATMs when most people take out money?
I think in the analysis that I referred to a moment ago, talking about the distance to cash access points, one of the reasons that the distance most people have to travel on average, I don't say on average, it's different the further remote you go. One of the reasons though why that hasn't changed a great deal in recent years is because of the strong geographic coverage of alternative points like bank post outlets, and I think it is a relevant question of whether those offer full branch services, and I think I definitely think that's a relevant question. Those alternative means of accessing cash that I mentioned a moment ago, they might not be perfect substitutes for full banking services, for example.
So there is a need for potentially post office or a postal bank or a people's bank to have greater role than they do right now, to provide full banking services potentially.